Come on there. There we go.
All right. So Revelation 20 says, "And I saw a messenger coming down out of heaven, having the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He seized the serpent, the old snake, which is the traducer, and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and cast him into the abyss, and shut it, and sealed it over him, that he should deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were finished. After this, he must be freed for a short time. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. I saw the beings of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Yeshua and for the word of God, and such as did not worship the beast nor his image, and did not receive the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and set apart is the one having part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him 1,000 years. And after the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the war, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. They went up over the width of the earth and surrounded the camp of the set apart ones and the beloved city. Fire came down out of heaven and devoured them. The traducer who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. There was found no place for them. I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and they opened scrolls. Another scroll was opened, which is the scroll of life. The dead were judged out of the things which were written on the scrolls according to their works. The sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. They were judged, each one according to his works. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. If anyone was not found written on the scroll of life, he was cast into the lake of fire.
You remember in the previous chapters we were talking about death and Hades and the sea, and both are able to contain the dead. So here it actually recapitulates that, right?
I'd have to go back to. I don't remember. I didn't go over 19 with y'all, but.
Well, I mean, if you did have any comments on 19 that you would like to add, by all means, go for it. That's part of the rules. You're allowed to do that.
Yeah, I'd have to read over it, but that is interesting if that's the case.
But death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, but not the sea that gave up their dead.
Right. Yeah.
They're like the sea that gave up their dead is the Gentiles to me, and then death and hell, the Jewish, wherever they. It says death and hell. I don't know why it says death, but hell or Hades rather, was thrown into the lake of fire. But like, why does it say that? It just says it gave up their dead.
Yeah,
and then there's like, were the dead that were in the sea in Hades?
I would imagine they had to have been. Yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't thought of that.
That is no.
Yeah, from what I've kind of like read, and I mean, just kind of looking at just things here and there about like how the ancients kind of viewed the sea is like, I think they kind of viewed it to some extent as like a holding place for the dead, like especially if like, how they were really big on like burying bodies, and it was important to have a proper burial and whatever. But like if a person died in the sea, like their body wasn't recoverable. So like I think what I kind of gather is they had this thought process that, oh, this person was like lost, like their body was lost at sea. So that's kind of what I get from it. And really, like I think 13 is just saying the dead from everywhere, like every place or thing that held the dead, released the dead. But I think death and Hades were like the main things that were focused on in terms of being thrown into the lake of fire, because Hades was like the place where the Jews believed the dead went, as well as I think it was the equivalent of like what the Greeks believed and death was that thing that had hold over the dead just in general, you know.
Right, that makes sense.
I guess it's whether, I mean, because C could be translated more as what do you say, metaphorical? Is it possible?
I think it's very. I mean, ultimately I think it's more or less metaphorical. Like I don't think it's literally saying like if there was any place that had like that literally held the dead, like from a gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of? From a cosmology standpoint, I think it would have been Sheol or like Hades, basically, that actually held the dead. I think the sea, like, yeah, I think ultimately, like, these beings would have been, or souls would have been in Sheol, but I think this is metaphorically or, you know, symbolically saying that all these places release the dead. Wherever the dead were, they were released. That's kind of
it is interesting though, that
hyperbolic.
it has two categories. There's actually two categories. One is the sea, and the other is death and Hades.
Yes, correct.
Or is Death and Hades the sea? Is it like, what do you call that? Where
Hebrew parallelism.
Yeah. I don't know.
It could be the sea encompassing everybody as well. True that.
Yeah, I mean, pretty interesting stuff. I never like really looked at it that way. But
what about the beginning though? We got to start.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can jump back to the beginning and talk about the 1,000 years because I know we've got some different views here.
Even before we get to the 1,000 years, though, we have this angel come down from heaven having a key to a bottomless pit, which obviously isn't literal because how do you have a bottomless pit? But and he's got a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, bound him 1,000 years. So, like, when is that? That's where we're getting into the 1,000 years.
If he had a key, then that means that he could release them, right?
Yes. Okay, wait, hold on. So he's got the key to the bottomless pit, but he lays hold of the dragon and he bound him. So he opens the pit and then he puts this dude in the pit.
Right, but
Thing.
Why would it mention the key?
Well, because he's the key holder, of course.
because you have to open up the lock to put the lock on.
Why there's a lock on it.
Doesn't it say that only Christ had the key somewhere? Like he had the key to.
Yeah, he has the keys to death and Hades or something like that. The keys of.
It is very interesting that it calls it the ancient serpent. We go immediately to Genesis 1, right?
Right. Let's see. It says he laid, like, in some versions that I've read, it said he laid hold of the dragon, that old serpent, which is called the devil and Satan. So it's, like, again, who are we talking about here? Like, is it a snake or a lizard, a snake with feet, or is it like an angel that can shapeshift, or like who that guy? We won't go into that, but I'm curious.
I'll say to me, like, it seems to be going back to the garden ultimately. Like that's the first place where we see this adversarial, like, serpent, more or less. Right. And that's why I think it says, like, here, okay, you see the dragon, and then I think there's a specific reason why it's called, Satan is called the serpent of old. You know, like the ancient serpent, the serpent of old, however you want to see it, because I think it's supposed to take us back to the beginning, ultimately.
Right. But if you take, like I said, if Satan just means adversary, well, the adversary of old is indeed the serpent. It's just an animal.
So he bound him. When does he bind him?
Well, he binds Satan. He binds the adversary for 1,000 years.
Well, whoever. When does that take place? When does he bind him?
Right. Yeah, that's one of my questions. When does he bind him? For me, I think it has to be like during the time when the apostles were running around doing the thing. Jesus comes, he binds the strong man, and then for that whole time up until like 70 AD, and then right at the end, right before the end, he's loosed again for a short season.
Could you please give me an exposition on on verse 4, please?
Me?
Anyone?
I'll share.
Go for it.
What are the thrones?
What are the thrones?
And who are the judges?
He saw thrones, and I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them, and I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, and for the word of God. Go ahead.
So I basically like with these, I just kind of want to just almost really just use scripture to like define it more than talking per se. But here, I'll share my screen. So really, in terms of the thrones, I think we can tie that back to. Hold on. Let's see here. Matthew 19:28. So it says here in Matthew 28. Actually, let me start higher. I'll start in verse 26. It says, looking at them, Yeshua said, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Then Petros answered, behold, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? And Yeshua said to them, truly I say to you, that you who have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on the throne of his glory, you also will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100 times and will inherit everlasting life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. So I think that's how I see it. So the thrones were the thrones that Yeshua promised, whether they were metaphorical or literal, like in cosmology, cosmologically, however you want to say it, in the heavens. I think though they were the same thrones, regardless, that Yeshua was speaking of, and I think that these were the people who were following him in the regeneration, or those who were of that first century generation, basically, who are the ones judging and whose judgment was given to them, basically.
Okay. Take a stance, brother.
I don't think it's
metaphorical or literal.
I don't think it's literal thrones. I mean, how many thrones are you going to really have out? That's going to be a lot. It's a lot of chairs.
I think they literally were helping decide.
They were.
Yeah.
Literally judging.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Did they have a literal throne,
Through the 12 thrones, right? There was 12, right? So everybody who was of that tribe through that one throne, like, boom, all your voices are being heard. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't look at the thrones like whether physical. I mean, like I don't look at that as an important thing as much as it is of, hey, Yeshua said this, like that they would be sitting on thrones or they would be given judgment, and so I mean that's what I look at as important. Like now, maybe there were thrones in the heavens or whatever that they literally sat on, and were in the unseen realm. Who knows? But I mean, I think what's important is that judgment was given to them to carry out.
So, but like, when did this happen? Because the next verse does say, verse 5 says, but the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished.
So,
first resurrection. So when was the first?
I would say if you follow the trail of when the disciples were supposed to judge, reign, that this would have been 66 when Christ came. And I believe that those who were part of this first resurrection were those who had died during that quote unquote regeneration period, or the coming in of the old covenant, or coming in of the new covenant, going out of the old. And basically some of those who were caught up off the earth, I'd say they were that was this group. Specifically here when it talks about resurrection, those who had actually died during that period. So I would say 66. Around 66, after 60, sometime like shortly.
Am I like misremembering something? Was there like a resurrection or something, some wording that sounds resurrection like happening around the time where Jesus either died or resurrected himself?
Yeah, there was a physical resurrection of bodies out of the ground, but I believe this is speaking of bodies out of Sheol ultimately. Like I think this I used to not believe this, but at this point I believe this is the same nature of resurrection as the second resurrection.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm just saying. To me, it's obviously the opposite. I'm thinking like that was the resurrection there. The first resurrection would be the one that happened way back then, and then you have the 1,000 years where Satan is bound while they're doing the whole preaching and teaching. They're although they're being persecuted, they're not being killed. They're not being overturned.
Sure. I believe there's a verse that would, to me, it gives great evidence against that theory that there was a resurrection before Christ's coming, or basically a resurrection of saints before Christ's coming.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Okay.
And so just to share that, just because
I was curious what you were thinking.
Yeah, so and because these are the verses that like I had to look at when I was like, okay, well, does this make sense? Like, how does this timing work? But then, I mean, to me, it fits together. Like now, the whole Satan piece and him being bound, I'm still trying to work that out. But like as it relates to the judgment of the saints and the resurrection, that's what makes sense as like a foundation piece. So let me go to 1 Corinthians 15.
We find ourselves there a lot these days.
Yeah. It's a pretty important section when you're talking about this. So 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's around like 25 or 23, something like that. So here, I'll start in verse 20. So it says, but now Christ has been raised from the dead and has become the first fruits of those having fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, also the resurrection of the dead also came through a man. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then those who are Christ at his arrival, then the end when he will deliver up the reign to God, even the Father, when he will have put down all rule and all authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. So if you follow what Paul is saying here, though, as it relates to resurrections that he's speaking of, Christ was the first. Like, Christ isn't the first that you see like defined in Revelation 20, but he's the prototype. He's the example, right? So Christ is the first, more or less. But then the next resurrection that you see Paul define after that is the resurrection that occurs at his coming. Then I believe he's alluding to another one at quote unquote the end. That's why I think he says then the end, just like he says then the end and whatever. So basically, if you look at that, you would be putting a resurrection between Christ's resurrection and Christ's coming and the resurrection that happens then. So you'd be putting another one there that the scripture here doesn't speak about, if that makes sense.
So basically in Revelation 24, when it says, I saw thrones and they sat upon them, that couldn't happen till Christ's coming. And then they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So we've established a timing that makes sense. I know Albert was kind of thinking 30 AD. Have you changed your mind at all, Zach? Or are you still stuck on 30 AD?
I mean, I hear the points and everything. I mean, right now I'm going to just say, not sure.
What about, is there anything that, because like Albert brought up the point about, Christ binding, is there anything from the scriptures, I can't think of anything offhand, that shows when Satan was bound? I know, Armand, you mentioned, you're still kind of working that out.
I mean, I know, like, in my mind, it's, Jesus says, in order to, cast out these demons, in order to, I guess you could say, like, plunder the rich man's house, you have to first bind the strong man. And the context Jesus is saying is, like, he's casting out demons, and the Pharisees say, hey, he's using it by the spirit of Beelzebub, or however you pronounce it. And Jesus is just like, well, I guess pretty much you can't, like a house divided can't stand, meaning, hey, if I'm the devil in that sense, or I'm using an evil spirit to cast out evil spirits, they can't like stand together. So that means I'm using the spirit of God, casting out the spirits of demons. And the only way that you can do that is you first bind the strong man. And, so in
Wasn't
that
that
sense,
before the cross, though?
yeah, that's before the cross. And then, so where would it be portrayed? And I think in my mind at the moment, I think Matthew 4 is where everybody in the world fails, Jesus overcomes in that sense, where you have the devil tempting Jesus, and Jesus rebukes him 3 times using scripture, and he wins, you can say. So
Yeah, but didn't the devil lead Judas to go jump off the cliff, though, after this point?
yeah, I mean, even
So, I mean, he couldn't be bound, could he?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it was the devil that made him do that, or Satan entered into him, things like that. I mean, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." I see those verses.
Not an actual entity. It's
I
just
don't.
a term.
Well,
like
yeah. So
beyond that argument, just
yeah. I mean, the thing is, but in the sense, it could be. I mean, maybe. I mean, yeah, I see those points as well, and I really don't have any argument against it. I mean, I could just say again, the word Satan doesn't mean, in the sense, it could mean just an adversary. So, like again, Peter was not the devil, but
and
Jesus.
wasn't Paul preaching, battling Satan and the higher principalities after Christ's resurrection?
He doesn't say the devil, and he does say that the devil will be trampled underfoot shortly in Romans chapter 16. And it says under your feet. It says, verse 20, Romans 16:20 says, the God of peace shall bruise Satan under you, or shall break Satan under your feet shortly. Mm-hmm. So I mean, in the sense, it's like, do you have? I mean, so in my view, it's like,
Ephesians 6 does say, "Devil, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil."
Yeah, and again, like Diablos, things like that. It doesn't necessarily specifically mean, like, I guess,
like sometimes it could be your own. I
mean, either we. So either, I mean, I think what Jesus says about the strong man is a pretty good argument, because he says that you have to first bind the strong man. So, in the sense of cosmology of the devil being the ruler of the demons or whatever, in that mind view, the strong man is the devil. Jesus says you have to first bind the strong man to plunder his house. Yeah. So it's either that interpretation is wrong and it's not talking.
Well, no, it doesn't have to be wrong. He can just, instead of binding him in 30 AD, he can still bind him in 66 AD. So it doesn't have to be wrong. Just the timing is different.
Would you say Jesus was casting out demons before 60 AD?
Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus hasn't even died yet, and the binding of the strong man has already occurred.
Right, and that's the law to me. Yeah.
So you have.
But then you would have, when you have the 1,000 years beginning before Christ even died, then, and I mean, how do you reign with Christ before he even reigns, I guess?
Well, again, I don't think it's like a specific. Let me go back to Revelation. My biggest thing in my view at the moment is you have every element of these things, I guess, in the sense happening before 60 AD. Specifically, exactly when? I mean, maybe because again, verse 1, it's the devil being binded. So if you want to go in like an order here, I mean,
Where
maybe
are you
that
looking
was
at?
in Revelation 20, verse 1.
It starts with the binding and it ends
Yeah,
with
so the first thing is the binding of Satan. So that starts everything. So you have the binding of Satan. Jesus says, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, you know that the kingdom of God has come upon you. So, I mean, Jesus was casting out demons. He says he was doing that because the strong man was binded. And then he also says, if he does cast out demons by the power of God, then you know that the kingdom of God has come upon you. So, I mean, like the kingdom's here. They're, in that sense, I mean, you have them as priests. They're ruling. They're judging. They are ministering judgment upon the congregation. The apostles' doctrine. Kick this person out of the congregation. He's doing this specific sin. I mean, so you have these elements there.
What about just to maybe bring everyone together on a possibility? If he is bound, basically sometime during Christ's first ministry, whether that's at his baptism or shortly thereafter, wherever, he binds them and he's bound, and that the 1,000 years starts then. The thrones and setting on them can still happen in 66 AD. The resurrection doesn't have to take place till his coming, does it? Or is there something that would prevent those from working out that way?
No, definitely. It's not just one little snapshot of time. It's encompassing like a whole span of time.
Yeah, the whole 1,000 years. I mean, like you said, like, so if the devil's locked up in the beginning, right, you could have in human time 20 years go by. Then you have, more elements happening, you could say. I mean,
And then he would basically be loosed from
at the end of it.
66 to 70 AD at the same time
that
they're resurrected.
Yeah, and then the Gog and Magog war is literally what chapter 19 is.
Well, yeah, so I think Gog and Magog. That's the next question. Like,
so that sounds like basically kind of the two millenniums theory, which, and I haven't ruled that out. Like to me, like right now where I sit, it seems like I don't have much support for it. But basically, that's what that would sound like. And I have heard saying, some people that do or possibly hold to there being two millenniums, which that would kind of seem like more or less.
How is it?
Why would you say two? Yeah, I'm a little confused on why you say two as well.
No, because of the time. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, then basically you're possibly saying that, okay, if Satan was bound from, the time that Yeshua was casting out demons to 66, is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I'm proposing anyhow, yeah.
Right, okay, and then
just as a thought.
Right, but then he's loose at 66. So the thing with that, where I'd say it would create two, which, like I said, I haven't ruled this out, but where it would create two is because then you would actually have the resurrection taking place the first resurrection taking place at his coming. And remember, they reigned 1,000 years. So basically you would have Satan being bound till 66 AD, which would be 1,000 years. Then you would have another 1,000 years where the saints are resurrected at his coming, and then they reign at that. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and so, I see where you're coming from.
Right. And so that's honestly, that's been one of the biggest difficulties for me. So like, here's my foundation is the timing of the ruling and reigning. And then like, especially one of the biggest verses was that resurrection verse, because for me, in my mind at this point, they're basically between Christ's resurrection and the first resurrection at his coming. I'm not looking for another resurrection because Paul doesn't indicate one. So I'm like, okay, if I know then that that's the time period of the first resurrection at his coming, and if there is 1,000 year, then for me, I'm like, okay, somehow this binding of Satan has to fit in there somewhere, unless it actually is two periods, which, like I said, haven't ruled it out yet. It's just I don't have a lot of support for it yet. Well, or yet. Go ahead.
If let's just say the way you're seeing it, if the 1,000 years is 66 to 70 AD, just one millennium. how did Satan maybe not deceive the nations during that time period? Because to me, it seems like that was a lot of, the war almost seems like the major deceptive.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, that is one thing. Like, even, a matter of fact, so I actually have a the best theory that I've seen was a guy who actually kind of sees what I see in terms of like the 66 AD, because he's like, yeah, I can't see the 30 to the 70 or 30 to 66 like reign just based on like what you see in the time or the time context and when they said the reign would occur. But basically, he gave a theory. I mean, I can pull it up if you all want to hear it, but I mean, I'm not sold on it either. But it's something.
You can pull it up if you want, but I will say, like, which nations are you talking about that are being deceived here? Like, what do you mean by nations? Like, who is exactly being deceived here again?
So that I don't know. That would seem to be. I mean, for me at this point, that's up in the air or in question as well. I would assume it would be like the nations, like everyone outside of Jerusalem. But I mean, yeah.
But yeah, because I mean, this is also going to get into like the other question that I had, like Gog and Magog. Who are they? Like, because I'm pretty convinced on who they are. I went back to Genesis to find out. But that's just my guess that it's the Romans and all of their cohorts with them.
And that's my general assumption based on kind of what I've seen. But I mean,
same here.
Right.
So, but then see, it says right here in verse 7, but the rest of the dead, and when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. And then right after that, in verse 8, it says, and shall go out to deceive the nations. Which nations? Which are in the four quarters of the earth. Okay, those nations. Okay. Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle. So they're deceived to go on to battle. They're the ones that are deceived there, aren't they?
Right. Yeah, it definitely seems that way. So like here's a possibility of kind of what I'm thinking that could possibly fit within that time period is that the saints reign from 66. Maybe it's not, I mean, really, maybe it's not all the way to 70 that's described as like the 1,000 years. Maybe it's really just talking about like up to, I don't know, 68, 69, when the destruction of Jerusalem was really about to occur. Because remember, there was kind of like this break period where like there wasn't a whole lot going on, but then it intensified like after the four Caesars and the Roman Civil War. So perhaps that might be the time where it's like, okay, Titus has now gathered all these cohorts that are actually going to come against Jerusalem and destroy it. So that's a thought. Oh, go ahead.
I just thought of something, because you said there's 2 millenniums. Maybe there's not 2 millenniums, and it's more like Zach and Albert are thinking because of this. Okay. Maybe the living and reigning with Christ isn't talking about heaven, the spiritual realm. So maybe it kind of works like this. I saw the thrones and they that sat upon them when they were resurrected in 66 AD. But those that reigned with Christ were those that were living on earth and reigning with Christ during that millennium. They weren't, the living and reigning didn't necessarily have to be in a spiritual realm where you get your new body.
Gotcha. So for me, of course, the only issue that I would have with that is that at Christ's coming, like, I don't see that there's anyone left, because remember, the living or basically those who were alive at his coming were taken up with those who were dead. So if you don't hold to
right, but this would still be that doesn't affect that though, because they can still because they would live and reign on earth from 30 to 66. Wait. And then they would be resurrected at 66.
But doesn't it say that they reign, like, basically, doesn't it seem to indicate that they're reigning from the time of the resurrection?
Like, I'm saying maybe it's not saying that though, just throwing out as a possibility. Maybe it was referring more to the earthly living and reigning than the.
I mean, there was
just as a possibility.
There was a sense of spiritual ruling with Christ. I mean, I just think, I mean, there is a possible way to make it fit before 66 AD in a, with things in Ephesians that says that you've been, you're reigning.
But then I guess verse 5 says, but the rest of the dead.
Yeah, the rest of the dead. That's like, why is that thrown in there? Because it's clearly just thrown in there.
Well, then it could be, so they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years on earth, 30 to 66 AD. But then the rest of the dead from 66 to 70 weren't resurrected till 70 AD. So that would be like the first fruits were at 66, and then the Old Testament believers would be in 70 AD. And then it doesn't really affect, it kind of could possibly work out that way.
Interesting.
And nothing really has to go against one another that way.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, no, definitely interesting theory. Yeah, I think one of the bigger things, and I feel like I might have gone over some of these, but like I think greater. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, because when it says they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years, it's kind of describing some things that happen on earth, like beheaded, not worship the beast, nor his image, nor their foreheads. But then you could say, well, they all died because of that. But, those were all earthly things. And so you could say they were living on earth when those things happened. So I don't think it'd be a stretch to say, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years, because it was referring to those people that had done those good things on earth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely get where you're coming from.
And then if you did go that, then Zach would be right, Armand would be right. Not to say that Zach and Armand have to be right. I have to be right, but the Bible obviously has to be right.
You know what? I think you're right.
Yeah.
But you tell me.
I mean, it's definitely interesting stuff. That's for sure. I mean,
tell me if the next verse sounds destructive, right? Number 9. I wrote that here for some reason. 9, and they went up on the breadth of the earth. Right. This is the people that were gathered together, Gog and Magog, whose number is the sand of the sea. Right. Those guys. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down out of heaven and devoured them.
I think we can all agree that was talking about the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed in 70 AD.
Well, no,
that's hard.
It can't be. No, it cannot.
Yeah.
It can't be, because it says compass the camp of the saints.
Well,
we talked about that before, but I mean just the timing wise.
What, and the beloved city? Oh,
right. Well, here's what's interesting about this, and this verse, like these verses, have given me some difficulty with even what I was just saying about, okay, maybe this is the nations coming together against Jerusalem, like toward the end, like almost near 70, because this doesn't seem to play out the way it did against like Jerusalem. So if you look at this, for one thing, so they went up over the width of the earth and surrounded the camp of the set apart ones. So okay, there's two ways I think of looking at that. One, the set apart ones in that situation are just like the Jews in Jerusalem who are at that point are apostate, or it's actually talking about like the saints as it's used throughout more so the New Testament. Whereas like the set apart ones are saints in the Old Testament. Like if you look at Daniel, I think it's just speaking of the people, like Israel, like not delineating between like righteous or unrighteous, but like just the physical people.
Cool.
Whereas the New Testament seems to get into like, okay, the saints are the believers. So I mean, it's possible there, but here's the other thing. So when it says, and the beloved city, let's see here, and they came up against the beloved city, fire came down out of heaven and devoured them. So if you notice, it's not saying that fire came down over heaven and devoured like the city, but it came down and devoured those who went up against the city. And then also it calls it the beloved city. Whereas throughout Revelation, it's like described as Sodom and Egypt and all these bad things. So it's like, to me, it almost seems like the New Jerusalem more so than.
Right. The New Jerusalem, exactly. Like, I think yours read slightly different, and I think that's why I said that. But like, there's something here that was like striking me, and it's the it's the fact that, you know, this utter destruction by fire, right? The world-ending event, right? The whole world's gonna get burned up, some stuff like that, right? But it says, and fire came down from God out of heaven, right? So like, does that have to be literal fire? I mean, come on, like, think about it, and devoured them. Devoured them how? Annihilated them, burned their bodies up, or like, you know, like now the whole gospel just went out to the whole thing, and like the fire of God devoured them. You get it? See how I'm doing the play on words there?
Well, I mean, just something to think about. I'll get to that in a second. I'll definitely comment on that. But the devouring them, is the devouring the saints and the beloved city, or just the saints?
Devouring. Who is
or is the devouring those that came against the camp of the saints,
or both?
To me, it seems like so. If like me reading this, I'm seeing it as like the saints were protected in this situation. Like the saints were protected against those who came up against them. Like, because the context seems to be like that they're victorious, if that makes sense. Like the saints here.
That's why I see it as well, that Gog and Magog came together to battle these saints, and then God came down and devoured Gog and Magog.
Right.
The problem with that, for most people, this is where full preterism has a big problem, because history doesn't really record Rome being destroyed, but it does record, and the Bible does prophesize more what Albert said, that the sons that afflicted Jerusalem would bend their knee to God and realize that he was the true God and worship him, you know.
Yeah, that was the fire that consumed them. It wasn't necessarily an actual physical burning.
Well, there was a physical fire though too. So I mean, you know.
Yeah, exactly like you were just saying though. Like,
and the empire.
So, I mean, it's definitely a tough verse.
Yeah, no, it really is. Like, and so here's another theory. I'll just throw this out there. Like, I mean, I can't say, you know, how great it is, but like another thought process I have is like, okay, you know, could it have been the Romans trying to come against like all the Jews, like not thinking of, okay, Christian versus like apostate Jew, and they're like coming up against like Jerusalem, right? Or coming up against Jerusalem, but they're basically they're not victorious because the true believers were not there to even be destroyed. Like they got the apostates, but the true believers were victorious in that they were taken up, they were gathered, they were safe at that point. And then from that point forward, I guess you kind of maybe have the decline of Rome or whatever, however you want to see it. Or maybe this is just saying, hey, the saints were kept safe. You know, I don't know. That's just another theory.
Right. Well, you do. I mean, I do imagine the armies as they were pushing south, like coming towards the city, Jerusalem, like they would have been pushing people out of their cities and hitting all sorts of towns, taxing them up, taking their stuff, like, you know, doing the hurt on everybody. And they would push all those people down south towards Jerusalem. And then there you go. Then they finally surrounded the city. And once that happened, it was game over. Like if you weren't already out, you were stuck. But all the people.
Yeah, man, it's definitely a possibility. You know, as they're coming down from the north, they run into the camp of the saints as well, and the city.
I mean, the camp of the saints, like Pella, like is that the place? Because it's the only place I know of where like I heard where like they went. Like, did everybody just go to Pella?
Yeah, I don't know if I see that, because remember like when
first, because it said flee to the mountains. Like which mountains? The ones to the left, the ones to the right. Like, does it matter?
You also have to remember, like, not all the Christians fled to Pella, because not all the Christians were like Jews living in Judea, you know? So like you've got, and then also when it talks about in Matthew 24, when Yeshua comes back, he would gather his saints from the four corners of the earth, which to me, like, seems more indicative of like, they didn't come together in like one central place. Like it seemed like they were still throughout the Roman Empire.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't mean that they all went to one place. Right. Totally. But anyway, I'm just saying, like right after that, then that after the fire devoured them or whatever, yeah, the fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And right after that, it said, and then the devil that deceived them that's when the devil gets thrown into the lake of fire with all these other lovely things, where the beast and the false prophet are already. So how did the false prophet and the beast beat?
This is the verse that makes me wonder if the devil or Satan is a person instead of a spiritual. But it seems by the beginning of it that it was the one from the garden.
Yeah, well, I would say that I think this is still consistent with that, because like if you remember what is it, like when Yeshua talks about judgment, he talks, and I'm like paraphrasing, but you will go into eternal fire prepared for Satan or the devil and his messengers. So it would seem like regardless, like it would have been this, they were destined for the same place. So like whether it was a spirit, spiritual entity or the people.
I know I can't really letters, but like the devil, it just says the devil that deceived them. It doesn't say and Satan who deceived them.
Well, the one thing I will say to that is that if you adopt full preterism and you see it as all fulfilled, whoever that was, spiritual, or if you want it to be an adversary, he's done with, and you don't have to worry about him anymore.
True that. That is true. Like, ultimately now, if you're a full preterist, it doesn't matter because he should be, like you said.
And I think, that's because Matthew was saying, we were talking about the other day, the advantages to full preterism, and this is one I forgot to mention. I mentioned there's no more fear, but everyone, most churches will blame sin on the devil and themselves, but this leaves it to just yourself. You can't blame the devil anymore.
Exactly. That's kind of what I'm trying to get with all that.
Yeah, everybody does say the devil.
Yeah. Now I would say that
the devil, like what is the devil? Like it's not a dude that can like instantly teleport between me and you at the same time who whispers sweetful fancies in our ears,
I would say that there seems to be evidence for at least demonic spirits though after AD 70 though. And I think that's in Revelation. And I hadn't realized this for the longest, but
you did see something in Revelation that supported that?
Really? Yeah, I actually did.
Wait, what did you say?
Like Revelation 22, maybe, or?
I think it is if I'm not mistaken, I think it is actually in Revelation 22 where it talks about it has become a haunt for like oh no, actually I'm sorry, Revelation 18 too. Okay. So this is going back, but so let's see here.
Okay, yeah, so, great has fallen. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, because like that's one I've often overlooked. I'm just like, oh well, spirits are gone, but still, like I don't know. They're always in the back of my mind, like, are all spirits just gone? But
yeah, which one is it? Because I'm
18:2.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah. So he's talking about the destruction of the city, and it says. He shouted with a mighty voice, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babel the Great, and she has become a habitation of demons, a cage for every unclean spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird." So this is describing the actual fall of the city. And so, like when I'm looking at it's now become a habitation for these things, that would indicate to me that they weren't destroyed at the time that the city was destroyed. Like they were going to dwell the so.
Which is exactly the same description I would give for you for the city of Sodom or Gomorrah, or perhaps the whole pre-flood world. It has become, the habitation of devils. Yeah, who lives there? People. Who's messing up everything? People, right?
Of course, unclean spirits and demons.
And the hold of every foul spirit, which is just a parallelism.
Well, we've got that camp before, man. We've had those debates before, but
hateful bird. What does it mean by hateful bird? Like really? Like
if if it is a demon or whatever, so would those be separate that weren't followers of Satan then? Because I thought because you had to bind Satan to get rid of these demons, but now they would be just some type of free demonic type thing, or
here's the thing that I'm looking at, right? So like if I look at like what the Jews believed, like for example, Daniel, right? If you look at Daniel where it talks about I think it was Michael, or no, I'm sorry, it may have been Gabriel, but he talked about, and I think it's Daniel chapter 9, that he had tried to come to Daniel sooner, but the principality that was over Persia stopped him, and Michael was the only one that helped him out. Like, if you actually look at that, there is a passage that would indicate, it's like, okay, well, wait, where do we get these ideas of these angelic or spiritual rulers that were over these nations? Like, what is that? But if you actually look in Genesis, there's a verse where it talks about he laid out the nations in accordance to the Masoretic text says the sons of Israel. But what's interesting is the LXX actually says the sons of God or the angels of God. So if you actually look at that and you follow that, then hey, just based on what they're saying, what their belief is, whatever you believe, but based on what their belief is, I think there's strong evidence that they were supposed to be spiritual entities. So like if I'm connecting that with, okay, these spirits, like in these basically almost these camps, right? So like, okay, Michael and his messengers, right? Or Michael and his angels. So like, okay, that could be one group of spirits, right? But then there could also be Satan and his spirits. So, but there could also be, so and so and his spirits. You know what I'm saying? So that's something I'm thinking about, that maybe when it says Satan and his messengers doesn't necessarily mean that's every quote unquote evil spirit that was taken out completely at 70 AD. Like, one, I believe God could use any spirit to carry out good or evil, but there could.
I mean, like, I love it. You use the word spirit all the time, and it's like, dog, am I a spirit? Are you a spirit?
I'm not talking about that kind of spirit, Albert.
But that's what could you see maybe that's kind of how it's talking about it? Like the spirit.
Honestly, with
it's saying like the messengers of this guy and the messengers of that guy. Well, if I'm
it's talking about the princely leaders, the princely people that were.
I'm just saying, like, it's talking about 70 AD stuff, and like you got two groups of people. You got the ones that are on the bad side and the ones that are on the good side. So, like, honestly, it all works out in my mind.
I know we've had this conversation over and over again. Here's what I'll say. Like, I don't, I know that some people don't believe the whole like spiritual beings and all that stuff. Like, I get that. However, I think if we're honest, I think we have to at the very least acknowledge they, in the first century and before, the ancient people believed in these things. Like, I think there's too much evidence in scripture to say that, no, they actually didn't believe in these things. Like, these were just people that they were talking about. 100%. I don't think they were talking about people.
Well, what about, I mean, is there more to, or is this pretty much like the lone wolf verse that would describe how these might affect someone? Or because I mean, here it just says, Jerusalem basically was where these places was. I don't see it really, saying, okay, well, it's going to go everywhere on earth type thing. But,
Right. I would almost assume, like, if this is talking about like spirits or demons or unclean spirits or demons like habitating this place, to me, that opens it up for there being more than just like these local, like I'm thinking like we're talking about these are beings that just exist on the earth, or they exist just period. And those are, you get what I'm saying? Like,
right.
That they may have flocked, quote unquote, like if you just kind of paint it as a picture, like they may have flocked to Jerusalem because of what happened. But I'm thinking more broad, like, hey, there's probably there. I mean, the way they at least saw it was that there would be camps or quote unquote legions of messengers with quote unquote heads, like leaders, like we see Michael, who is the the prince of your people, or so and so who is the prince of Persia or over Persia, and these beings that were like hierarchy or like a hierarchy which were under them. So I mean, to me, that opens it up for if all these different nations had these quote unquote princes, like maybe that's just a thing that God has done. Like they're spiritual entities over each of these, and that's why I'm thinking maybe Satan was just, like I said, one who was put in that place to oppose Christ at a specific time, and he served his purpose and he was defeated along with his messengers. But to me, that doesn't necessarily rule out that, okay, there aren't others that were, you get what I'm saying?
I follow you 100%.
No, you don't.
I
well,
do.
I mean, it just makes me wonder.
What you're saying, and like that's a fine answer. That's perfect.
Well, I certainly get the perspective. I mean, it opens up a big argument with full preterism that, you know, we still see this demonic activity where, you know, like Don Preston and William Bell, and like I mentioned earlier, that, you know, totally defeated, nothing to worry about anymore. But yet then you brought up a point that would probably help people adopt full preterism a little easier, because they do still see these things today happening. But, you know, then when I look at how do we approach those, you know, Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Well, it says the wiles of the devil, I guess, but then I see the devil being destroyed. But then I guess it says, for we wrestle against, not against flesh and blood, but against principalities,
right,
against the rules of darkness.
You up, dog? I'm trying to beat up your ideas, your thought.
Yeah, we get that, but I want to look at both sides. I'm not willing, or I'm not trying to deny you, right, Albert. I just want to discuss both things so people can hear it and I can hear it.
Sure. So let's think about this though. Okay, so like I think if we all, you know, I think most of us would agree there is still spiritual wickedness in this world. Like whether you want to see it as spiritual, like individual demons, or like there's spiritual like wickedness. There's battles that do have to be fought like daily, or, you know, I don't think that was just limited to there and like now there's no issues. You kind of get what I'm saying? So if it is a spiritual entity or not, like there's spiritual battles. So for me, I'm like, okay, you know, spiritual battles could very well go with spiritual entities that God uses. Because I mean, that's if he uses them in the Old Testament to test people, to carry out, you know, his will, whatever. So I mean, why not today, you know?
Well, I just think about, you know, other things in the Bible where it says, okay, you know, say you're battling some type of sin, whatever that be, and you know, and it's a demonic type sin, let's say, you know, and you open the door somehow by sinning first, and you open up that door, and then, okay, then you stop sinning. And then, okay, well, now you start sinning again. Then the Bible says, well, now 14 more come, you know, now you open up the door. It'd been better if you would have, I can't remember how it puts it, you know.
But the way that it goes is like you open the door and you can't close it. Like you can't close it. Like you need a priest to come by and close it for you.
Well, I mean, Christ is obviously our answer, but I mean,
if you're going to use a Ouija board, you open the door, right? But what if you decide one day to not use the Ouija board anymore, but you still can't get rid of the demon that you already summoned? You brought him upon yourself.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What's the Bible's answer?
Well, that was the Bible's answer. Like, you brought it upon yourself. You did it. You opened the door. You had those thoughts. You did it.
Well, I mean, I would think, you know, Christ could pretty much drive out anything, but, you know, you see like things on YouTube, like, you know, this will be a prayer to get demons out of your life, your body. And then you see people that do seances, and, you know, I talked to a lady that told me she was spinning in her room. You know, I don't know. It seems like there should be you know, obviously prayer. I think prayer and fasting, and then some Bibles don't say fasting, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And some Bibles say prayer and fasting is the only way, I think, and then some don't say that. Okay, yeah, let's see. Mark 9:29. So the King James says, by prayer and fasting can come forth by nothing, but like, let's try the ESV. See, this kind cannot be driven out anything but by prayer. So some Bibles don't include fasting, but the King James says you need to do fasting and prayer to get these out of your life. So just something to think about, but I think we're on about the last verse of Revelation, or did we get there?
We have a little bit to go, just a little bit. Oh, okay, yeah, we have just 11, 12. You know, you got the great white throne and him that sat on it, whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was no longer a place found for them. That's the passing away of the old heavens and the old earth, right? Yeah, but his words remain. Then he saw the great the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were open, and another book was open, which was the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works.
You know, the people or a lot of people will look at this and say, you know, photoplarism can't be true because, you know, all the dead are judged at this point. You know, no one can be alive after that point.
Right, because this is the great white throne judgment. Like, this is everything got burned up, like we just talked about earlier. Like, everything got engulfed in flames.
But, you know, I would point them to Isaiah 54, Isaiah 27, Zephaniah 3, even Isaiah 2, Revelation 14, as all Isaiah basically 50, I think from 52 to 66 really tells how it's all going to work out. You know, and I really like the easy reading version of Isaiah 6, like I think 52 or 53 to all the way to 66.
Right, so this dead here, this is the dead that aren't covered by the first dead. Like, all the rest of the dead, this is all the rest of the dead. All the rest of them, right? You would agree? The dead that were, you know, small and great before that's all of them. Up until that point, obviously.
Right.
And now it just...
I think some people look at, you know, the last verse of it.
Sorry, go ahead.
And then some people look at the last verse, you know, if any's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Well, some will say, okay, well, that was the final judgment. There can't be any more names written in the book of life. So how could full preterism be true?
Oh, really? The book of life?
Yeah, I think that's the way a lot of people look at it.
That's why you have to be like, what do you mean by book of life? Like, do you think it's an actual book? Like, what do you think it's going to be like? How many pages is that going to be? Holy crap! That's a lot of pages.
It's on a digital USB. Right, that's why we go up to be caught in the air. That's why the cloud keeps all that information.
Oh, just burned me real good.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me grab the book of life. I got it right here. Let's see.
Am I in there? Can you find me? Look under
I don't think I get to look at the book of life, but that's the one thing we can't judge. It's kind of weird. I think it does say you can know your salvation, but you can't judge other people's salvation. It's kind of...
You want to? Yeah, I would never be like, you're not saved. Like, just because we disagree doesn't mean, like, you know, like, it doesn't matter. Like, all this is just chump change. Like, this is just us trying to further our knowledge together. That's all we're really doing here right now. I'm not trying to be like, Armand, you have to believe me on Satan. Or I'm not trying to be like, Rob, you must believe me on flat Earth. Like,
I'm not gonna say that. I just know that you always prod. So I'm gonna stand firm. You know, I don't actively bring up Satan. So,
well, of course you don't, because like you find it not important, right?
Well, then we know Albert will come out of the woodworks.
Yeah. I mean,
it's the good thing. Like, I'm just saying, like, it's unimportant. I agree with you. It is like a side issue. Like, ultimately, if you just believe in the true Jesus Christ, then we're all good and gravy. It doesn't matter what we believe otherwise.
Yeah, I think Matthew brought that up about partial and full preterists, or any of the different views, really. I mean, like Zach brought up earlier, what Paul preached, death, burial, and resurrections, all he preached, basically.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, it's fine. Like, doesn't matter if there's an angel named Satan or not. Either way, according to our full preterism, he should be taken care of. Right? We can at least all agree on that.
I would agree on that.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Got him. Good. All right. So the next verse we saw all the dead and the small. Okay. Yep.
I don't think we talked about 2014 a little bit, but
yeah, the 14, the end, which is what we started with. Look, dude, that's the thing I wrote down here. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Like, what does that mean? I always wondered, like, what does that mean? Oh, but maybe what if it meant something along like the lines of like the last people to die would be the first to be resurrected, but the first ones to be resurrected would be the last. I mean, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
I had a thought the other day that I never thought about before because of Armand's view.
Okay.
And was that the first resurrected were those right after Christ, because Armand was talking about the other day how we were reading into, I think, 2 Thessalonians or 1 Thessalonians, or maybe in 1 Corinthians 15, that we thought that the old preceded the first, but it really didn't say that. It was just what we thought. And that the first fruits, how did I put that the other day, Armand? I sent it to you.
That like the first fruits, like, so the first were last and the last were first, in that the old covenant saints who were first basically ended up being resurrected last, and the new covenant saints, the ones who were like of Yeshua's generation, were resurrected first. Kind of
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first, that came in the Bible, the first that lived, well, they were resurrected last, and then the last saints were resurrected first. They were the first fruits.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking with when I mentioned that. Totally.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, definitely it makes sense for that, but it's just a thought.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, it definitely fits the theme of what Yeshua said, because I think it seemed to, I don't know, it might have been even broader than what a lot of people think.
But these last verses here, and then we can be done. There you go. Then you can all go and sleep in your beddy buys. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire.
You want to take a stab there, Armand?
Well, let's see
Probably
here.
The first stab, because I'm just gonna ruin
it. Just in terms of interpretation, or
the lake of fire, the second death, why them are important, maybe.
Just what you think about these 3 last verses.
So I mean, the way I take it is 13. I believe that when it talks about the sea and death and Hades giving up the dead in them, that it's kind of just generally speaking saying that all the dead were released, like from wherever you might believe that they're released. It's death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire. To me, that's saying that death, which kind of what I was talking about with Matthew, that idea of death, that what I was trying to get at was to die, if I die right now, is different than the state of death, if that makes sense, or death having a hold over me where I'm continuing to sleep. So to me, this is that state of death, or death having a hold over someone, making them sleep in Sheol. It was thrown into the lake of fire, therefore that no longer exists. Same thing with Hades, or Hades or Sheol being thrown into the lake of fire. It no longer exists as a place, in cosmology or whatever. Like it's done. Like nobody goes there anymore. And then let's see here. Yeah, they were judged according to their works. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, and 14, death and death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So I think this is I look at this as somewhat key, because it talks about it's saying the lake of fire, but it's telling us what it, I think, literally is, which is the second death. So it's described as a lake of fire, and I think a number of other things like Gehenna fire and all that stuff.
Right.
But it's describing the second death.
Yes.
The
easy lake of fire. I mean, what is it? Lava? I mean, come on.
The easy reading version is because, if I read the King James on that verse.
Oh, I'm sure it says hell.
Even let me just switch to the ESV. It actually kind of sounds like the second death is gotten rid of too. It says, then the death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. It almost kind of sounds like universalism, but if you read the easy reading version, I think it's a little better. It says, and death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This lake of fire is the second death. Because I think, I think it's interesting how the easy reading person, this lake of fire is the second death. Then it kind of sounds like it's still around, but the other ones kind of sound more like it's at Hebrew parallelism or whatever.
Yeah.
But and then what you brought up the other day, we need to worry about the who can destroy body and soul, not just body.
Yeah.
I think that indicates some type of different death.
All right.
That there is a second death. If you die bodily, that's one death. And if you die bodily and soul, that's a whole different ballgame. That's a whole type of death. The second death. It doesn't specifically say second death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And from what I recall, I don't remember or can't think of anywhere in the Old Testament where it even, I don't know if it even hints. Well, no, the only place I can think of is Daniel 12 at this point, where it talks about resurrection to life and then resurrection to everlasting damnation. And I can't think of anywhere else where it talks about the second death. So for me, the death that they were focused on, all the way up to Yeshua's time, really did seem to be the first death. That's what they were concerned about. But then Yeshua, almost like he did everything else, brings it to another level. Don't worry about this death, this, physical death. Worry about the second death.
Well, I think Revelation 2 might kind of clear it up, because it says, don't be afraid of what will happen to you. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison. He will do this to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but be faithful. Even if you have to die, continue to be faithful. I will give you the reward of life. And then it goes on to say, everyone who hears this should listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. Those who win the victory will not be hurt by the second death. So here they were, saying, you're going to die,
right?
But even be faithful for that. But the true reward, even though you died, is going to be when you beat the second death. That's when you get the victory.
Yep. In my view, at least.
This is, full preterism just seems like everything, just the puzzle just fits so much nicer than other views. Definitely there's questions, obviously, and, tough verses, but if you had to, put your percentages on something, full preterism, I think, is where to put your percentages.
I think as
I might agree.
preponderance of evidence is in our favor.
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, yeah, I mean, I thinking back to like my times as a believing in futurism or whatever. It's like there's so much just stuff everywhere that like
Well, you had so many more questions.
Yeah, way more questions.
And now it's like, oh, now I see. Now I get this. Okay. Yeah. And it just fits so nicely. And you're like, gosh, how did I not see this before? And it's like, and then you see.
It's almost as though one time you were blind and now you can see.
Right.
It's a miracle.
You still breathing, Stacy?
I'm gonna end the phone. I'm gonna end it. I think that was good for now.